Hello, I hope this is live just now. This is the Sofa Talk on how Europe is gonna meet the requirements we have for the wind industry. Here with me we have four panelists. I will start introducing them. Anne Strooband, that is replacing the Minister of Energy from Belgium. And we are lucky because the reason for that is that the minister is defending the offshore wind in front of the parliament, and this is very good for us. So happy to see you here. And we have Giles, that is the CEO of WindEurope, very well known in the sector. Mary Torregot, that is the global public affairs for Vestas. And then we have Martin Knox, that is the CTO for SITF, that is one of the biggest first-tier suppliers of the wind sector. So here we are. The dynamics of the session is going to be easy. We are going to have a chat, like a sofa talk amongst all of us. So I will be, let's say, bringing into the floor some questions for our panelists. And then we will have also the space for the audience to raise some questions. So please feel free to use the chat and we will be picking up your questions. And so let's start. Anne, I will give you the first question. I think, and this is very well connected to what the minister is now defending. How much energy is the Belgian government planning to install by 2030, and how this is reflected on the National Energy and Climate Plan?
Thank you for the question. Yes, of course, our minister is responsible only for the offshore portion of the wind industry in Belgium. So we are still number 5 worldwide, but we like to consider the numbers actually based on the amount of citizens and the small coast we have, and then we are even occupying number 2 worldwide still. We pioneered 10 years ago with the first offshore wind farm, not the first worldwide, but at least one of the first to be installed. And we are actually wanting to still pioneer and build further on that experience. We still consider our wind farms the national pride, like the minister says, like our beer, chocolate, and Belgian fries. We should consider also the offshore wind as our pride in Belgium. Today we provide energy offshore then for about 2.2 million Belgian families. By 2030, we will double that capacity. So our national energy and climate plans considered the growth from a current 2.2 gigawatts to go to at least 4 gigawatts in 2030. And the aim is still to accelerate this or possibly even make it a bit bigger.
That's very good.
Of course, yes. Of course, we also have the post-COVID recovery plan, where we also have a project, and the plan was also approved today by the European Commission, that we want to build also a first-of-a-kind energy island along the Belgian coast. So I think that establishes also the pioneering position we want to aim for. And since your question was also onshore, of course, not falling within our responsibility, but the responsibility of the regional counterparts, but also from their side, they want to grow to capacities of more or less 4 gigawatts. So the same order of magnitude than what we have offshore in our plans.
That's very good. Giles, and this is bringing us into what the industry is prepared to do. I think what Anne has explained to us is showing that there is, let's say, a commitment from the member states. The European Commission is willing to increase the target circa 40%. So wind energy is going to be one of the pillars of this energy transition for sure. Probably is going to be the biggest energy source that will be enabling this. How well we are prepared to expand this onshore and offshore? You are mute, Giles.
Thank you very much, Javier. Many apologies. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So today, the European Union has 180 gigawatts of wind energy capacity. That's 165 gigawatts onshore, 15 gigawatts offshore. With its new higher climate target for 2030, 55% emissions reduction rather than 40% as it previously was, the EU is going to raise its renewable energy target from 32% of our energy in 2030 as it is today to somewhere between 38 and 40%. That means even more wind energy by 2030 than the EU had previously envisaged. Specifically, it means increasing our capacity of wind energy today from 180 gigawatts to 433 gigawatts by 2030, more than doubling it. That means building every year 27 gigawatts of new wind farms across the EU, onshore and offshore combined. Last year, special year, 2020, the EU built 10.5 gigawatts of new wind farms. Over each of the next 5 years, we estimate, looking at the current project pipeline and the volume of permitted projects, that we will build 15 gigawatts a year over each of the next 5 years. So we are only building slightly more than half of what we should be building in order to meet the 2030 targets. Before we then think about getting from the 2030 target, 433 gigawatts, to the 2050 target, which is 1,300 gigawatts, 300 offshore, 1,000 onshore. That's the number that the EU is looking for. Now, what is the problem here? The main problem is permitting. We are not permitting enough new wind farms, either onshore or offshore. And that is because the permitting rules and procedures across countries in Europe are too complex. It's also because there are not enough staff working in the permitting authorities to process the high volume of permit applications that now need to come forward. And we need to solve this problem in order to meet our 2030 targets, let alone the even more ambitious 2050 targets.
Good. Mary, this is bringing us into another topic. I mean, so we have the member states saying that they are willing to commit. The European Commission is doing the same. Giles is pointing there that the industry is prepared, but we have to tackle some issues on the permitting side. But just coming back to what the OEMs are suffering, I mean, we know that the OEMs have been struggling with very low margins in the last years, even though Vestas is one of the best performers. But which is your vision about this price compressor and how it's going to evolve?
Sure. I think I certainly think we and our shareholders hope the situation changes soon. But I think, of course, competition is good for the industry, and that's how the world should be. But of course, this pressure on prices isn't really just a problem for us as OEMs, but also it's unsustainable in the longer term if we as OEMs are going to make the investments we in the industry need to make in R&D and moving forward our technology, both in onshore, offshore, floating, and indeed power to X in the future. But I think there's a number of headwinds at play here, isn't there? There's the short-term kind of uncertain permitting issues that Giles touched on there that makes it very hard for OEMs to plan our production schedules, and particularly in a world of high raw material prices that we're seeing at the moment. That's just another headwind that makes life even harder. I think our CEO has said, I think OEMs can't be wizards and make these higher prices magically disappear when we're putting in offers to governments and our customers as well. And I think, don't forget, the pandemic is still with us. We're fortunate here in the EU that hopefully things are improving, but of course, globally, the pandemic is still with us in markets like South America, India, and parts of Africa as well. So there's a few things that are making our life a little difficult at the moment, but I think a number of those items that governments and the industry, we can help ourselves. We can increase our ambition. We can look to longer term auction calendars. We can look to sorting out problems with permitting as well. And also we can look at how the industrial strategy at EU level operates and interacts with the policy framework as well. So they really act together, and then perhaps bring in the sustainability, circular economy issues as well. Make sure those three really operate together, and hopefully that will kind of address some of these headwinds we're seeing today that will hopefully abate in the slightly longer term.
Thank you, Marin. And Martin, just extracting some of the words from the media speech, I mean, she was pointing that R&D is going to be one of the key features. The sector, the wind sector, is very special because we have, let's say, a kind of integration role of the OEMs, and then we have a very large first-tier suppliers, as your company is. How are you integrating the innovation within your customers' needs? I mean, how this is integrated?
Yeah, so we have today a very close collaboration in our development projects, but also in technology development with some key OEMs, and Vestas is for sure one of them, but not the only one. And this is for different reasons. I mean, you pointed out already, Mary, that to be competitive, to have better cost proposition, LCOE in the end, is crucial for each and every OEM. It's also crucial for wind as such, because we still compete also with other sources of energy. And yeah, the easy times to improve there are somehow in the past. So we are a matured industry meanwhile, and only in the very close cooperation between suppliers, tier one suppliers, we as a gearbox manufacturer, of course, and the OEMs, we still can gain potential. So for us, for gearboxes, it's basically always torque density. We have made enormous steps in the past, and that requires new technologies. So we can't develop that on our own and then go to our customers and ask them to just take our gearboxes. So gearboxes are also perceived, obviously, as a component which has in wind history seen some failures, and is crucial for the overall performance of the wind turbine. So it needs to work, and needs to work reliably, and new technologies need to be validated respectively. And we, of course, as ZF, we do that very thoroughly, but we need to do that in alignment with our customers, so that we then also have a fast time to market, because it's not only validated from our point of view, but also validated from our customer point of view. And so we have already in the development phase of new technologies a very close cooperation with our key customers. So that's one. If I look on the concrete development of a new gearbox or powertrain for a customer, then also other aspects come into play. For instance, noise and vibration. I mean, we talked about permitting. As a matter of fact, especially onshore, there's also a lot of local resistance against new wind farms. And some of it is, to my understanding, irrational, but there are also some hard facts, which, for instance, noise behavior of wind turbines is a critical one. So we need to perform on that. And nowadays we have the tools, we have developed tools to really simulate already in the development phase tonality behavior, for instance. But that a gearbox manufacturer and developer cannot do on its own, because it's a complete system behavior. And here also the very close cooperation between OEMs and suppliers is absolutely key, and we do that today.
Thank you. I will take the opportunity of just recalling my past experience as an engineer, and having here Vestas and having here Martin. So I have two questions that are connected for you. So please jump in as you feel. I mean, obviously, Vestas acquisition or buyback of MHI Vestas is raising a lot of questions on the offshore market for Vestas, if this is going to be crucial. But then the gearbox discussion on having very large machines, not just offshore, but onshore, and being Vestas one of the companies that is focusing on, let's say, non-direct drive solutions. How do you perceive this scale up in machines? How this is going to affect your long-term view?
Good. So I think that was to Martin. I'll go first. I mean, to perhaps address the buyback a little bit, I mean, I think Vestas has stood on 3 legs for a long time of onshore, offshore, and our service business as well. And I think it's quite easy to forget that there's still sort of 80–90% of the global wind market is onshore. We know offshore's coming, we know it's going to be big, but that's still where the market is today. And I think, of course, we have an ambition to be, our ambition is very clear, to be a leading player in offshore by 25. So not to say we won't be active, but I think none of that takes away from the attention that we give the onshore market. I think it reflects more the fact that we as the EU and society, we're going to need it all, as the phrase goes, if we're going to meet our climate ambitions. And I think I'd like to think as a world leader, we can do more than one thing, focus on more than one thing at once and do it extremely well. So I think that's where we sit in the buyback position at the moment. I think in terms of the scale up of the machines, both onshore and offshore, I think it creates fascinating challenges with our supply chain, such as ZF, both, I think, particularly offshore, as well, onshore and offshore. How are we going to transport these machines? How are we going to move them around? What kind of infrastructure do we require? And then what opportunities are there for the supply chain in different parts of the EU? How do those different designs create different opportunities? And how can the EU support that within the industrial strategy and helping those suppliers grow and meet the new opportunities of the bigger machines?
Yeah, so the question was specifically on offshore, but perhaps I would also like to elaborate on both on and offshore. But taking offshore and geared first, I mean, when I look 10 years back, by the way, we had the same discussion also for onshore. So is there a future for geared, who will win, etc.? So onshore, the battle is over, I would say. There's in China, of course, a very big player who still uses direct drive. But let's see whether that stays like that. I think overall it's clear that lifecycle cost of energy is lower, LCOE is lower, bottom line with geared solutions. Offshore, it's not that clear, but it's also not the other way around. So we really see both technical solutions, direct drive and geared, as on same level for offshore applications. And crucial for the geared solution is obviously that the gearboxes are reliable. Yeah. And I said a couple of years ago, and that was cited quite often in the social media or internet, that for us building a 15 megawatt gearbox is technically no issue. We are today doing that. And also 20 megawatt will be, if it comes, and I think it's just a question of time, technically not the issue. Obviously, we have seen in the past some gearbox failures offshore. We've also seen gearbox failures onshore if we look back. But offshore, they hurt much more because of the enormous service costs you have offshore. And if it comes to replacement of big components like gearboxes, this is really hurting, and also attracting obviously quite some curiosity, and people really see that. And it is an issue, but it's not a general issue. So we can go through, and there are also from ZF very successful offshore geared solutions, which work meanwhile for a decade very well. But that is a challenge. So we need to be even more reliable than onshore to make geared solutions sustainable offshore. But we are there, not just very optimistic, but we are that on a very solid basis. Challenges onshore, by the way, with the growing sizes of turbines, and that's an unstoppable trend. So we come from far, and I remember that I'm also since decades in the wind industry. So always people expected that the growth will stop, at least onshore, because offshore it's more obvious that the bigger turbines are the better turbines. It has not stopped, and I also think it will not stop. But it's only enabled by innovation. So we still have enormous logistical barriers onshore, and they also stay. You need to pass bridges, you need to transport on roads, etc. And let's say today's 6–7 megawatt turbines and tomorrow's perhaps 10 megawatt onshore turbines are only possible with enormous innovations on powertrain and on gearbox, because I talked about torque density before. So we doubled torque density in the last 5 years, which basically means that the same size of gearbox can transmit double the torque today. And this is needed because otherwise the gearboxes would be just too big to transport it still on the roads, to transport the nacelles still on the roads, which the gearboxes need to fit in. So it is, of course, also a lever to keep costs under control and to lower LCOE bottom line, but it's an enabler for the big turbines as such.
Good, thank you. And when I was preparing this Sofa Talk, I was trying to follow some of the points that the minister was bringing, and I discovered that she was in a post talking about a match between Denmark and Belgium, and then she was quoting that we will not just fight on this, but we will cooperate on the transmission lines. And Denmark is planning to have all these islands for having this hub of connections. I know Belgium is trying to do something similar. Can you educate us a little bit?
Yep. So when I was talking that we are second in capacity per inhabitant, Denmark is of course still first. But I think it will be good to connect the first two in offshore wind. Indeed, we are looking into a multifunctional energy island where we would build, I think, the first of a kind, which is approved as a project within the recovery plan. So we are working hard to get the concept fully finalized. And on top of that, of course, we also have the agreement with Denmark to connect in terms of interconnection electrically. And I think if we look a bit at the bigger picture, of course, if we look in the North Sea potential of 300 gigawatts by 2050, we need to find ways to connect that capacity to shore, which also there, permitting-wise, is not an easy thing to do. So we need to look at the meshed grid. We need to look further than our own borders. We need to interconnect and potentially also in the future then make the link to hydrogen. And as far as Belgium is concerned, we have a limited shore. Sooner or later, that potential will end. So connecting to other countries for us is especially important. So we are looking forward further to the results and the discussions moving forward from Denmark. And seeing if we can indeed, with our island, not only connect the second phase, but also be a bridge then as an interconnection towards UK or towards Denmark, and how we connect the dots, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So for us, it's important to get that energy. Also for our industry, we are very small, but we have a very high intensive industry. We have the whole petrochemical sector in Antwerp, for example. So the need for the energy and renewable energy is there in Belgium, and we hope to support them to decarbonize and move towards the energy transition in the future in 2050.
Okay, thank you. Giles, I would like then to close the loop. I mean, connections, permitting, the industry is prepared. So how this is connecting with the demand we need to have, let's say, to use all this electricity, how this is connected, for example, with initiatives like hydrogen. How do you perceive this?
Again, you are muted.
I'm doing the same thing again. Thank you, Javier. There has been a very interesting development over the last 3 or 4 years among Europe's energy consuming industries, especially the energy intensive industries. 4 years ago, they used not to like wind energy. They thought we were expensive. They thought we were messing up the energy system with our so-called intermittent offering. Now they are knocking on our door saying, please help us decarbonize our processes, whether it is through direct electrification or indirect electrification using renewable hydrogen. And this has been a huge change. Why are they now knocking on our door? A number of reasons. First, they now recognize that wind is cheap, that it is among the cheapest sources of electricity generation. Secondly, they now want to decarbonize their industrial processes and operations. Yeah? You put those two things together and they are saying to us, look, can you build a wind farm close to the factory? Or, well, can you build it somewhere else and we have a cable? Or build it somewhere else and we have a virtual power purchase agreement. And that could be with onshore wind or with offshore wind. We recently saw the agreement between BASF and RWE Renewables for RWE to supply 2 gigawatts worth of wind energy capacity to BASF to power their operations. And we're going to see much more of this. And already in Belgium, you've had one of your large energy intensive industries, Covestro, signing a PPA with one of your offshore wind farms. And this is great. We have to remember this also, that today electricity is only 25% of all of the energy we consume in Europe. The rest of it is the petrol we put in our cars, it's the gas we burn in our boilers at home, it's the fossil fuels that power our shipping and aviation and so on. And this other 75% of the energy system is nearly all fossil based. So to decarbonize, we have to electrify. And there are many parts of industry, heating, transport, buildings that we can electrify. And wherever we can electrify something, it makes sense economically to do so, to convert transport, heating, industrial processes to run directly on electricity. It will always be cheaper to run something on electricity than to run it on fossil fuels in terms of the final energy consumption. Now, we won't be able to electrify everything, but we can electrify 57% of the total energy system. We can then use hydrogen and its derivatives to decarbonize a further 18% of the energy system. Now that makes 75% of the total energy system that in 2050 can be running on electricity directly or indirectly, and our electricity will be almost entirely renewables in 2050. And this is what's driving the huge demand now for wind energy. And as you know, the European Union has said that wind should be half of Europe's electricity by 2050. And this is what's driving the EU's desire for this huge expansion in wind energy. But it's so encouraging to see that the end users of energy are getting this as well and are now acting of their own accord, knocking on our door, asking us to help decarbonize their operations. This is not just something which is being imposed on the economy top down by governments.
And Giles, just to connect, because obviously now we have all these national energy and climate plans, we have the goals of the European Commission. We are part of the, let's say, strategy, the industrial strategy of the European Union. Why we have to have wind industry? What we are going to deliver in terms of GDP contribution to the economy or in terms of jobs? Which is the value we can create?
I think that the citizens of Europe have an expectation that, yes, we will decarbonize the energy system, but can we please do it with technology and jobs here in Europe? And that's quite reasonable. And I think governments have an expectation that, yes, we invest a lot in this energy transition, but that should be supporting jobs growth and investment in Europe. Quite apart from the fact that in Europe, we know how to do it better than anybody else in the world. We've got the technology. So of course, it makes obvious sense to use it. And we already have the jobs. We have 300,000 jobs in wind in Europe today. And just by 2030, that number will rise to 450,000, provided governments deliver on the commitments they've made in these national energy and climate plans that you mentioned, Javier. Now, let's look in a bit more detail at the economic benefits that wind energy brings. Every time we build a new wind turbine in Europe, on average, that wind turbine will generate 10 million euros worth of economic activity across the whole value chain. Yeah? It's creating jobs and growth in rural areas where we build our onshore wind farms, in areas where not a lot of other industries necessarily invest. It's creating jobs in coastal communities, often once deprived coastal communities, especially for offshore wind. And this is really encouraging.
Good.
Yeah.
So I will be just starting to fit some questions that are coming from the audience. The first one is from Mary Begin from Tractable. This is for Anne and Mary. How will you members deal with the end of the life of turbines in order to meet the 2030 targets? Mary, Anne?
Would you like to go first, Anne, or shall I?
Well, I think I would pose the question to you as well as O&M, because of course we rely on the experience of the companies, and then we also will have one of the first projects probably also to be decommissioned or prolonged in terms of life. We also have an industry to be built on that, because there is experience to be learned. There are also in terms of foundations and so on potentials to learn and then expand the lifetime of the turbines. So and of course in terms of recuperation, I understand, and especially I understand that Vestas has certain solutions. So we are really looking forward to see how we can even go further into the decommissioning and the whole recycling and circular economy, taking into account that already a lot of the components are to be recycled. It's only a small portion which is still having issues. So we count on the technology companies to help us there to find our way.
And your very first.
Sure. I think for us, of course, Vestas has ambition. Am I? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. I mean, of course, Vestas it's a bigger priority for us, and we have an ambition of zero waste turbines by 2040 and a circular economy strategy coming by the end of 21. And I think there's a number of things we're working on, both in Denmark with the Decom Blades initiative, but also making sure we join that up with initiatives also in the UK as well, because it's not just an EU issue. We need to think of this as a regional market and a global opportunity as well. And I think it's another point, I made the point slightly earlier, it's another point where we also look to the EU to join up climate policy, sustainability, circular economy strategy, and also industrial strategy as well, to make sure we're seeing this fully in the round. And I think, of course, we will play our part as in the industry as a big industrial player, but also my questions back to the EU. You know, the EU is in a great position to pull together industry, academia, governments to really make this a competitive advantage globally for the EU, how we approach the recycling of turbines. So I think I also throw the question back to governments as well about how they can support us with many of these recovery funds that are available at the moment.
And just to recall that WindEurope, Giles, has made an announcement on a positioning for the landfill of blades. So the sector is taking a movement as a whole. I have another question from Nick Jesvers.
May I just add one thing, if I may? Because
Sure.
also in the supply chain, we can still make it more greener. I mean, we also have one of the largest steel factories in Belgium. We can also provide green steel in the future to make the turbines more sustainable. So also on the supply chain side, there's a lot to happen to make it a fully circular economy.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
And also, one before it gets lost a bit, I agree, of course, to all the statements which also Gilles made on electrification. So we absolutely need that. And also statements on now there is a push from industry really. Yes, and that was not a couple of years back. So it's not just politics, it's not just society. Also, all the industrial players really want to get carbon neutral now, want to get green. What I see really coming is a battle for green energy, green electricity, because also that field said we have ambitious targets, but for the next couple of years, we will not reach these targets. So the 25 or 27 gigawatt per year new wind installations we will hardly see for a lot of reasons, and then permitting being perhaps the most important one. And at the same point in time, we go forward with electrification. Now they're making steel with basically green electricity in the background, H2, etc. So that all will come, and it will end up in a battle for renewables.
Mm-hmm. This is connecting very well with a question that I was about to launch to the industry side. So Nick Giesberg, forgive me if my pronunciation of the name is not right, from SIF Group. How does the panel expect the supply chain to be able to handle the increase in demand for wind farms? And what is your biggest concern in this area? So I guess for Martin, Mary, and Giles, this is the question, is how we are going to be able to cope with all this increase.
Yeah, perhaps I start. I don't see an issue as such. So the industry is really ready to supply. We are a mature industry, and there's also this growth scenario, by the way, rather for the outcoming years. Yeah, so 25 past for the next few years. We don't see yet the global market growing. That comes only later. But that is obviously an attractive investment opportunity. We need to make sure that also there is some money to make for OEMs. You touched that in the last years the profits of OEMs was rather low, and also in the supply chain, obviously. So that's always needed, and that links a bit to the second point which I want to make. It's not a self-fulfilling prophecy that if the sector grows, then also employment in Europe grows. It is a tremendous challenge to stay and to be competitive with production in Europe. And so I see I think it's more than a risk. We also see today that major parts of wind turbines for installations in Europe are imported from other parts of the world, from Asia, obviously. And I think that's also something where politics needs to look at to give the right framework for industry to be and to stay competitive out of Europe.
Very good. Mary, do you want to add something?
Sure, I will do. I mean, we touched on, I think I agree with all of what Martin said, and we touched on the raw material challenge that we're seeing at the moment as well. I think the challenge I'd also mention would be people. Giles touched on how many people we're going to need in our industry to do all the great things that we want to and need to do by 2030 and beyond. And I think that's where we look to training of electrical and mechanical engineers, artificial intelligence, digital, all those kind of emerging industries that actually, as well as making big components, how we're going to manage our energy more smartly, how we're going to service our turbines quicker, all those things. I actually point to people as being a challenge for us as well.
Giles, do you want to complement? Because I know that you have all these skills initiative.
Fully agree with what Mary has just said on skills, and fully agree with what Martin said as well about the supply chain. I think for onshore wind, it's all about market volumes, which in turn is all about permitting. Yep. And the onshore supply chain in particular is under pressure today because it is competing among itself for a lower volume of wind farms that are being built than we might have expected and hoped for, and a lower volume certainly than what the EU want us to be building, as we saw earlier We're building only 15 gigawatts a year when we should be building 27 gigawatts a year. And that is increasing the competitive pressures among the players in the onshore wind supply chain. The capacity is generally there. We have 248 factories across Europe making turbines and components for those turbines, both onshore and offshore wind. We know we don't have enough capacity yet today to make the turbines, the volume of turbines for the expansion of offshore wind that we're going to need to be making in, say, 10, 15 years' time. So our factories for offshore wind turbines today are capable of producing up to 7 gigawatts a year. They're actually producing around 3 or 4 gigawatts a year today. That's the market demand. By the middle of the 2030s, they'll need to be producing up to 18 gigawatts a year. So we clearly do need to expand the manufacturing capacity for offshore wind. We also need to expand the manufacturing capacity for grid equipment and cables. We haven't talked that much so far about the need to keep building out the grid. You know, Europe is only investing 40 billion euros a year at the moment in electricity grids. It should be investing 80 billion euros a year to deliver the energy transition. We'll then, of course, need to build up the supply chain for the recycling of decommissioned wind turbines. And you mentioned our call last week, Javier, for governments in Europe to ban the landfilling of blade waste. Thank you.
Okay, I have a question from Lucas Pantil from Enel to Martin. I think you have answered this in a way, but still is something that is demanded. Wind turbines are getting bigger. Can gearboxes keep up?
Yeah, they can keep up with the increasing torque demands without getting too big themselves. Yeah, so that's a bit the challenge. But yes, we can keep up. So both onshore and there the transportation limits hit especially, and also onshore, where of course the overall biggest turbines and torque levels are reality and will only grow going forward.
Thank you. I have a question from Natalie from Macquarie. Question for Anne. What is Belgium doing to ensure that it's ready for tomorrow's energy market? And this can be very broad.
Yes. Yeah, of course, we are looking here on onshore and offshore wind. I think building further on the renewable energy capacity is the smartest thing to do. It's the one no regret solution. And of course, we still have limits into what electricity will bring us, and electrification will go first. We need also our electrons in terms of offshore capacity as electricity. Looking a bit further, we will not in the future, as we do now, import a lot of fossil fuels. We will need to make the change from fossil fuels to hydrogen-driven fuels or hydrogen or other derivatives. So we will ship the sunshine from where it is most cheapest. So we are looking further in expanding the supply chain towards, for example, countries not only Middle East, but then towards Africa, but also within Europe, southern part of Europe. But also offshore wind plays a role. So the further we go from the shores, potentially also hydrogen will play a role, and it looks that will also be cost competitive in the future. So it will be for us, I think, combination electricity and molecules, and finding the right balance to have enough flexibility, enough own energy, as well as importation, which we have always done and which we will do in the future, but differently.
Okay. May I add a provocative question, Anne, that probably is not just for you, and Giles can jump in. At least in my home country, we are suffering now from, let's say, a distortion in the market. Do you feel there is a requirement for redesigning the energy markets to cope with all these new renewables just joining the energy mix?
You mean from a market perspective?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's also with the evolution that we've seen in terms of the last years. It's also the reason why we are going for a capacity remuneration system, our CRM, which we hope to organize also the first auction by the end of this year, because you indeed see the shift going from investments in classical energy systems, which require less capex but more opex, and therefore play on the market as in terms of the marginal plant at that time, which will need to shift into renewable energy, which is a very low opex cost but a very high capex cost, and potentially also the CRM mechanism also goes into that direction. But perhaps if we look at 2050, we do need to consider making some changes or rethinking a few elements on the current market design. And the first step is done with the EMD guidelines, which also require more flexibility. The CRM mechanism will also support demand side management, will support batteries. So we are increasing in a very drastic pace the flexibility in the system to allow for more renewables, and it needs to go hand in hand.
Thank you. Giles, I have a question for you that is coming from Francisco Rojano from IH Cantabria. It's about if you visualize two different business models for wind energy, one for power generation, the other, for example, just for hydrogen production. So do you visualize this is going to be two different markets with two different applications?
A very good question indeed. We don't know yet what the hydrogen markets are going to look like, and this is a very live policy issue for the European Union and national governments, designing market rules that will incentivize investments and take up of renewable hydrogen. We do know one thing, and that is that the more variable renewables we have in the electricity system, we need to have very active markets, not just for electrons, but also for balancing and the other ancillary services that wind and other variable renewables can and need to be providing. Now, the first part of this is wind must always have free and equal access to these balancing and other ancillary service markets. And I'm talking here of the markets for frequency control, voltage control, inertia, reactive power, and so on. European law requires that we should have access to these markets, but there are still some countries in Europe that do not give us that full and equal access. Once you've given renewables access to these markets, you then need to create a market dynamic that incentivizes investment. And a country that has done this very effectively in Europe is Ireland. So they now have a system for auctions for all of these ancillary services, and different companies bid in. It's created a very active market which has incentivized investment in the necessary flexibility services, and is helping now to balance out the very high levels of variable renewables that we often have in Ireland's electricity market.
Good. I have a question for Mary. Again, I have to beg for pardon if I don't pronounce it correctly. Jingjin Luo, what challenges are we seeing for operation and maintenance of turbines? Are you researching new technologies to deal with these new challenges?
I think it's fair to say I've talked quite a lot about R&D today, and that doesn't just mean R&D in the turbine itself. It also means R&D in the whole life cycle of what we do, and that of course includes O&M and service. I think particularly offshore, we're seeing quite lots of exciting items such as drones, AI as well, to minimize the time that we spend out on the turbine, because as we've touched on, that's expensive. It's risky. It's riskier than undertaking the service either by remotely through drones or from the shore itself. I think we're always going to be looking at it, and actually as our serviced fleet grows in the EU, actually there's more opportunities to develop those kind of innovations. And actually I come back to the point, the EU is going to have this massive installed fleet. What a great opportunity to export globally the expertise that we're building in terms of the service as well.
And in the same direction, you are one of the 5 companies that are conforming what they call the Super League, so the top 5 performers. You are bringing innovation into the market. So in floating, do you perceive that, because today we have floating platforms and we are installing very traditional wind turbines on top, do you perceive that in the future we are going to have a specific hybrid or combined floating platforms with the wind turbine itself all together as a unit?
Sure. I think, as the industry knows, we're currently installing the largest floating wind farm in the world off of Scotland, and we're increasingly seeing inquiries about our new V236 15 megawatt for that going on to floating foundations. I'd actually say for once in floating, the turbine's the so-called easy bit this time for this innovation. Actually, we look much more to innovations in the foundations and the size of those, the materials required, and how the manufacturing of those is going to be matured to drive the cost down and to increase the energy we produce. So I think there's innovation coming on the turbines for sure. We wouldn't all be here if it wasn't. But actually, I think the innovation for floating needs to come on the foundation side first of all to really get the industry flying and commercialized.
Mm-hmm. A question from Ross Gould that I guess is global, but probably Giles and Anne can ask. The question is, how do local content rules impact overall supply chain development in Europe? So is local content something we want to play?
Well, I'll go first. Of course, by having that pioneering role, I think is also and just making sure that the turbines are there creates business on its own, and where you keep having innovation with those companies, you also ensure the local employment as such. Yes, I think we are looking to increase the business. We also had a study done by the Belgian offshore platform recently, also mentioning or indicating about 10,000 jobs that can be created by 2030 just by having our offshore wind business. So yes, I think it is a crucial part to focus on. And I would say, and perhaps expanding a bit the question, not only having the local employment, but also the engagement of the citizens themselves. And I think also that we are working on trying to have co-investments from civilians to involve them into our energy transition, to involve them to explain the bigger picture. And having them actively play an active role, not only in the flexibility and demand side management, but also an active role in the investments and the return towards our own citizens. And that is also something that we really want to look at with the next offshore tender.
Mm-hmm. Giles, you want to jump in?
Javier, when you look at the map of Europe and where are those 248 factories that are making wind turbines and components for them, you see that it is very spread out. You also see that it is most concentrated in those countries where the demand for wind energy has been greatest and where there has been the greatest clarity and long-term visibility about those countries' plans for the expansion of wind energy. And this
map is already in the webpage of WindEurope, so anybody can just check it.
Indeed. Indeed, and you can click on each of the 248 circles you see on that map, and you get facts and figures about every factory. It's on the WindEurope website. Now, let the market play its course here, and the investments will be made in those countries where it makes economic sense to have those investments. And the best advice we can give to any government, and we do give to governments, is give clarity on volumes, long-term visibility on volumes and market growth, and the investments will follow. If you try to force these investments through local content rules, that will be economically less efficient in the long term for you.
Perhaps I can also add a remark. I mean, we see when we look globally, we see in a lot of countries and markets local content requirements. And this is, to my deep understanding and conviction, the wrong way. It is overall it makes wind more expensive, and it's also then for the companies who do the investments locally to get into the local market really a risk, because if it's not a sustainable market over a long time, it will be a lost investment. However, I made the point before that I see it as a huge challenge to keep production in Europe cost competitive. And I think local content on requirements on a European scale, so not in a specific country, but in the EU, that we say a certain portion of the value needs to be created within the EU for EU wind installations. I think that's something to think about.
Okay, we have to be very fast because I think we are approaching the end of the session. Questions are popping up, and probably I cannot raise all of them, so I will be forwarding them to you. So please feel free to answer. So let me wrap up the session because for me, I've been in the sector for more than 15 years now. So it's the first time nobody's asking for money, or if we are asking for money, it's money for others. And we've been discussing that the money needs to be invested in the grids, needs to be invested in the ports. But the sector, the only thing the sector is asking now is having visibility, clarity, certainty that the rules are applied, so we can have permitting processes that are transparent, rules for the market. So this is giving the right time. But I don't know if you feel the same. Nobody was asking for money here.
Javier, we're not asking for money in the form of subsidies anymore, but it's very important that governments have revenue stabilization mechanisms in place through their auctions. And the best such mechanism is the contract for difference, which guarantees the revenue for the wind farm, say for the first 15 years. If the market price is below that guaranteed revenue, then the government pay the difference. If the market price is higher, then we pay back the difference to the governments. So governments can break even on these mechanisms. They can even make a profit out of them. The crucial thing about these mechanisms is that they enable us to minimize our financing costs, because we can go to the banks, they see we have a perspective of stable revenues, and they lend us the debt to build our wind farms. And that's much, much cheaper for society as a whole than us having to invest large amounts of equity in our wind farms. So it's very important that governments put these revenue stabilization mechanisms in place, and most of them do have them across Europe, and the European Commission is fine with that.
So certainty is what we are looking for. So I would like to thank you all for being part of this panel. I would like also to thank you, the audience. We have been holding close to 200 people in a continuous basis. So this was raising interest. And I think we have delivered. So if anyone wants to say something before we close. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.